Well, good morning and welcome. Here it is Monday morning, October 26th. We're just 8 days away from the election, or at least hopefully the beginning of the election results. And I would just like to say, remind you that tonight at the church we're having a time of all this day, a day of fasting and praying, and we're going to meet together this evening to really pray together as a congregation. We're going to have a time of ministry and directed prayer and worship and so forth, but really looking at the praying that God would have his hand of blessing, grace, and mercy upon our nation and by application on each of our lives. It's kind of an overstatement now to say this is probably the most significant election that at least I've seen in my lifetime, and prior to this, the elections were always really differences of policy. They basically had pretty much the same agenda, but they just differed on how to get to the same place. We're in a very different time right now. This cycle now is a difference of ideologies, if you will. There are two very, very different and non-complementary views of how to move ahead and what will define the nature of the republic from this time forward. You have the Democratic Party, basically, who are democratic socialists. They envision a kind of European socialist style of government, and which is very, very different. It means increasing centralized control of the government over the lives of people, whereas the Republicans more or less are into a idea of a non-socialist, or some people call it capitalist, materialist, but really it's a free market perspective of how that you give people more freedom to make decisions regarding their day-to-day life and less dependency upon the government as the safety net. And so, this is really a key point. And for me personally, the idea that I'm going to look to the government as my safety net has its real weaknesses. I mean, Christ, God is my safety net ultimately, and I don't disagree with any kind of governance issues necessarily, except that there has been over this last 7-8 months, I think, an overreaction which has led to an overreach by the government. And I find that governments, once they have a certain amount of power, they really don't want to give it up. And so we've had a massive intrusion in the name of health into our day-to-day lives, and the reality is that a lot of the actions can't be sustained from a scientific point of view. And every time you hear somebody say, well, you got to go with the science, or the science is settled, I guarantee you that the science isn't settled, and they're basically just trying to stop any kind of discussion. So we've seen that, a real intrusion by social media into our lives, where they've making the choice of no longer just simply being a platform, but now they're publishers. A publisher means that they can edit what goes out on their platform, and so they've really moved into a monopolistic style of information control that is more on the lines of the Soviet Union than it is any other thing. I think that the greatest threat to the Republic right now is social media, and the lack of concern that those who run it have about really having an equal and fair marketplace. But I'm getting a little bit off the topic because what we've been looking at is the 7 churches of Revelation, and we left off looking at the first of the 7 churches, which was the church of Ephesus. And as I pointed out in my introduction, that not only was the Church of Ephesus a literal church which had begun to drift away from the simplicity of Christ towards the end of the Apostle John's life, the end of the 1st century, but we also know that they are also prototypical really of many Christians. And so we can see Ephesus' style of Christianity in each and every one of our lives to one degree or another. And each of these 7 churches really serve as a marker, a kind of a warning, a review of where am I at in my relationship with Christ. And as I noted last time, the problem the Ephesians had is that, like all of us, they like systems, they like patterns, they like things that are predictable. In church behavior, we call it a liturgy, a way of doing things. And in many ways, their practices and behaviors were really good, but there was that loss of the dynamic of relationship. I mean, they had a religious spirit, but not necessarily a relationship with the Spirit. And I'm not saying that they had completely forsaken Christ, but really the way of doing church had overtaken what was supposed to be the life and the style of the church. And this is a common problem we've seen throughout history, particularly in countries where Christianity is the predominant social and cultural influence, that they begin to get into a stylistic rhythm that defines them that may not necessarily be more than the tradition or the habits or the preferences of a group of people. I've often noted that I think that we all have a tendency to sanctify our own preferences, and making the difference between what is the command of God and what are the preferences of man is really one of the important distinctions. So that I remember when I was first a Christian, I came under a lot of criticism because I had long hair, and they would quote a passage out of Corinthians out of context that isn't a shame for a man to have long hair. In doing that, they completely missed the whole message that Paul was trying to deliver at that point. But nonetheless, that was kind of a cudgel that they used to kind of hit me over the head and tell me that I needed to get a haircut and wear a black suit with a black tie and a white shirt. It didn't take me long to realize what that had really nothing to do with my relationship. My outward appearance, my physical dress, and all those things has nothing to do with how God looks at me and what is really central. Those are really cultural items. And the danger is that we can basically begin to mainstream our cultural preferences and saying this is the way it should be. This is always a danger, and I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican or someplace in between. You have to understand that you have certain cultural preferences and maybe even spiritual preferences that you kind of imprint on everybody else and expect them to rise up to that same level. Well, this was kind of the problem, I think, of Ephesian type of Christianity. Basically, they lose sight of the key ingredient, that if you take away all of the props, in other words, there's no church building, there's no church gatherings, as we've kind of experienced through the COVID shutdowns, you begin to realize, what is my life really founded on? My experience is I've seen many people, when those props are taken away, their faith falls away because they don't really have a faith in Christ, they have a faith in a system. And so that's always something that we need to be examining ourselves. But anyway, I'm out of time, and so I hope this helps you to give some thoughts to where you can reflectively look at your walk with God and where it's at. And hopefully we can begin to really focus on what is really key to me. Do I have an intimate, loving relationship with God? Do I read His Word because I enjoy Him and seeing Him in His Word? Or is it more of a religious practice that I engage in, a discipline maybe that I've learned, or a habit that was taught to me as a child? These are important questions I think that we need to work through and review on a regular basis. But I'll continue on tomorrow as we continue to look at the Church of Ephesus. Blessings and go in His grace.